we going to talk about today? I know we have a number of generals that we're discussing to go over, but who are we going to start with today?
I think we're starting with Bertrand Clauzel, are we not?
That is right. Yeah, Bertrand
Right.
Clauzel, very famous general, was born in December 1772 in the county of Foix, southern France. What do we know of his background? Did he have a noble birth or a nice upbringing? Do we know a lot about this man?
We don't know as much about him as, say, some of the marshals per se. We're
Right.
obviously delving deeper into some of the other folks, but he did have a good education, and he came from a prosperous middle class family.
We're going to discuss Clauzel today because he had a pretty diverse background and he fought on a lot of different fronts, correct?
Yeah, he really did. He was all over, although primarily sort of Iberia, southern France, that part of the world.
Got it. Got it. Okay. Well, he started his military career as a volunteer in the National Guard in 1789, and he becomes officer in 1791 as a lieutenant in an infantry division. And by the following year, he worked his way up to captain in the Chasseurs à Cheval. Was it easy or easier to get promoted during the French Revolution?
Yeah, absolutely. You hear military folks talk about battlefield promotions, and they were pretty quick in this day and age, especially as folks, ran through the junior ranks. And some of the folks that had had service as enlisted people before the revolution, found themselves as generals in within 2 years' time after toiling away and for 8 or 10 years to try and make sergeant.
Yeah.
This was not unique of the French army. This was unique, and I think it's not. I mean, this is just what happens in wartime. You have so much of a need for leadership that the
Right.
competent people, rise up to the top. And one of the unique things that the revolution gave France was that a lot of the constrictions of who can be an officer were lifted. So you didn't have to show noble birth. You didn't have to show how many parts of your family were ennobled. You didn't have to go through the hassle of trying to buy nobility to get a command. All those were stripped away through the revolution. So you get lots of people who would have been blocked previously from becoming officers who can rise quickly. Or in wartime, obviously, even people who were ennobled could rise quickly, with their skills. And no better example of that than Napoleon himself.
Yeah, and I've often wondered, like, if that was one of the reasons why the French army performed so well. They were promoted on merit versus birthright.
Well, I think that was certainly true initially. I think towards the end of the empire, a lot of the other nations had sort of caught up. And
Mhm.
while they still might be restricted in terms of, needing some nobility to get into the officer corps, they had so many folks that had enough experience at that point that even talented and qualified, nobles were coming to the rank. And maybe the reverse was true of France. They'd been at war for so long that there'd been so much fatigue among the officer class that I think by the end of the empire, the first empire, the leadership, which had been predominantly in favor of France throughout most of the war, starts to even out.
Got it. Got it. Okay. Well, getting back to our protagonist, Clauzel in 1793 is promoted again to major and serves under the future Marshal Perignon, and eventually becoming his chief of staff a year later, which is pretty good for a 22-year-old.
Yeah, absolutely,
He,
absolutely.
yeah, he distinguishes himself several times in battle and brought several enemy flags from Spain back to Paris to present them to the new government. Why was that such a big honor? I know I've read about Napoleon sending Marmont and some of his other aide-de-camps back with flags. Why was that a big deal?
And Juno, perhaps,
Yep, yep.
which in fact happened during the first Italian campaign. So usually that was a mark of honor. You're delivering good news to the government, and of course the government is going to shower rewards on the person that's gotten to deliver these flags. So not only intangible things like a ball that where you might be a guest of honor, but typically if they're promotions that need to be finalized, those are often done while the person is up there presenting the awards and banners and things. So lots of times if there've been battlefield promotions, they're confirmed, or many times the government could just confer a promotion at that point. So it's a great way to advance a career. And of course, you get to rub some elbows with, some more important people, broaden your network for future networking, which is never a bad thing.
Yeah, for sure, for
Yep.
sure. And kind of along those lines, he's transferred to the war in the Pyrenees against Spain, I think during the first coalition,
Hmm.
and he becomes a general of brigade, which again, he performs well. And in 1798, he serves as chief of staff under future Marshal Grouchy. And this seems to be common at the time with men like Caulaincourt and Marbot serving under multiple marshals, correct?
Yeah, and we talked a little before the recording about how many of the marshals, in fact, had experiences under as chiefs of staff, and I think that might be an interesting avenue for some research. I might get offline here and figure out how many of the marshals had a background as chiefs of staff at some point in their life,
And
because
I
I think
think
it would be
that's an
interesting.
important role, right? I mean,
Yeah,
to be chief of
absolutely.
staff.
Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely. And becoming more so important during the Napoleonic period, where permanent staffs were becoming more of a thing. Usually, armies in the campaign in the 18th century, when there was need for one, there would be an ad hoc, a staff put together. But starting with the French during the Revolution, and then spreading to the rest of the armies, that these staffs became permanent, and these armies had to rely, if you're trying to get 60, 70, 100,000 or more people to a battlefield, that's a logistic that's quite a logistic endeavor.
Yeah.
And especially if you're trying to campaign, as we'll find out for Clauzel in the peninsula, resources are so scarce that it takes an awful lot of planning to move troops, to make sure you have enough ovens for bread. You got to find wheat, you got to find fodder for the animals, and
Uniforms. Yeah.
uniforms,
Yeah.
boots, siege guns. If the siege warfare was such an important part of the peninsula, and trying to find enough guns of a sufficient caliber to affect breaches, it's all a logistical. It's all a real logistical challenge.
Hmm. Yeah, and Marshal Berthier was obviously the model, and all the marshals had their own chief of staffs underneath them. So yeah,
Sure.
a very interesting role that Clauzel held there.
Absolutely.
So he serves, however, things are going well, but he serves in disastrous Italian campaigns of 1798 and 1799, where Suvorov and the Russians handed the French generals several defeats while Napoleon was away in Egypt.
Yeah.
What happened there?
Well, the French just got outclassed.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the easiest way to say it. Suvorov was obviously a military genius of the age. I've heard many argue on the same level as Napoleon himself.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the French just got totally outclassed in 1798 and 1799. And it wasn't because they had bad people. Clauzel did a fine job. It's just that they got just I don't know how else you want me to say it. They got their asses handed to them by a
Yeah.
really, really qualified and talented Russian general.
Right. And I think Suvorov doesn't get enough credit. I mean, he does in the Russian side. I mean, the guy was practically undefeated, but his men really fought hard for him, and that he believed in efficiency of movement. He was a quick mover, just like
Yeah,
Napoleon was.
absolutely. I
Yeah.
think the only thing that really doomed that campaign ultimately was um, the Austrians and the Russians were working at cross purposes, and the
Hmm.
Austrians were more concerned with what was going on in the Rhine than necessarily holding those passes in Switzerland, which are so critical, passing between northern Italy and the Rhine, and where Suvorov was operating in northern Italy. Uh, the Austrians didn't lend him the support that he really needed to really threaten the French long term, and the French ended up ultimately prevailing, but it was more, I think we can lay the blame more squarely at the door of the Austrians, who just didn't have a great strategy.
Right. Right. Well, obviously Napoleon returns from Egypt and becomes first consul in 1799. And in 1802, Clauzel is sent to be part of the ill-fated campaign to try to reconquer the French colony of Haiti, which does not go well, does it?
No, not at all. In fact, France's commanding general Leclerc ends up, who was married relation to Napoleon, ends up dying from malaria, just like the bulk of the French force there. I think what's probably most remarkable about Clauzel's service in Haiti is that he survived.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
I mean, that's pretty amazing that he survived intact, and even as he's trying to get back, he's got that shipwreck off the coast of Florida.
yeah,
Makes his way to New York to get back. So it's a scrappy dude with some impressive abilities to to survive. I think that's
yeah,
the most
yeah,
remarkable thing about that part of that expedition.
yeah. One bonus from it, he was promoted general division by Leclerc before
Yep,
Leclerc
absolutely.
Leclerc died, so that's good.
Yep.
His next major assignment after getting back from that disaster is assisting Marshal Marmont, future Marshal Marmont, in administering the newly acquired territory of Dalmatia in 1808. During which time Napoleon makes him a grand officer in the Legion of Honor. Say what you want about Marmont, the guy was a good administrator, don't you think?
Yeah, fantastic administrator. I think a lot of that came from his training with the artillery.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of folks forget that he was trained as an artillerist. He handled the guns very well at Marengo.
Mm-hmm.
Arguably was a key element in turning the tide of that battle. But I think of when I think back about the marshals in terms of their administrative ability, I'm not sure that there would be one that might be better than Marmont. But I'm also a fan of Marmont as a military commander. I thought he did a fine job in 1813 uh, and 1814.
Yeah.
Um,
Yep.
he had a good package of skills and abilities. Uh, Ultimately, we know his story. We probably
He,
need dwell on that, but
yeah. But I
um,
think it's interesting that Clauzel probably was taking, he worked under Grouchy and Perignon and Marmont, and he's taking probably little things from each marshal, don't you think?
yeah, and that was a strength. Obviously, getting moved around to all of these different marshals and getting to see all of the different ways that folks do things, and just that experience alone has got to be fantastic.
Mm-hmm. Indeed.
Want to make a podcast? Spotify's got a platform that lets you make one super easily, then distribute it everywhere, and even earn money, all in one place for free. It's called Spotify for Podcasters, and here's how it works. Spotify for Podcasters lets you record and edit podcasts right from your phone or computer. So no matter what your setup is like, you can start creating today. Then you can distribute your podcast to Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are heard. Video podcasts are also available on Spotify.
In 1809, he's transferred to the Peninsula War under Marshal Massena, who's one of the best at the time. But it wasn't going very well in Spain. Why was it so hard for French commanders to keep their track record intact and succeed in this war?
Oh boy.
I know it's an open-ended question there.
We could probably do multiple podcast episodes on just that. But so one of the greatest failings, I think, of the Napoleonic system, and if we talk specifically of France, is that it all worked great when Napoleon was in theater. So the marshals would support each other because Napoleon was there. But when you get a situation where Napoleon's in Paris and these guys are operating, in Andalusia or in Portugal or in Aragon or Galicia or wherever they are. Of course, they're little islands unto themselves.
Right.
And, a lot of these guys are petty and jealous and, irascible. So Massena ends up with 3 corps commanders for the invasion of Portugal. He's got the emperor's favorite, Andos Junot. He has the fiery Marshal Ney, and he has Renier, and Clauzel is one of the divisionals in Junot's corps. So these guys don't cooperate with each other. They don't really get along. And even in moments of battle, in 1811 at Fuentes do Nero, Beziers, the marshal could have lent a great deal of help with imperial cavalry, but wouldn't help Massena out.
Right.
And
Right.
Soult wouldn't cooperate, and then you've got Jourdan, who advised Joseph, but nobody respected Jourdan, and
Yeah.
Joseph wasn't a military leader. So it's just a mess, and that Napoleonic system breaks down without the emperor right there riding herd over these people.
Right.
They let their own petty jealousies get the better of them.
Yeah, and I was reading Charles Amon yesterday in preparation for the call, and then he and maybe some others said that he probably should have made Massena just overall commander in Spain, but then he would have been giving one of his marshals control over 200,000 troops, and maybe he didn't feel comfortable doing that, even though Massena wasn't really a political animal.
Yeah,
He was.
and I don't think that would have made a difference ultimately. So initially, the way Napoleon conceived it, the emperor himself was going to go command that army that was going to invade Portugal, and
Mm,
with the ultimate aim of driving Wellington, off the continent. But if you recall 1810, this is when he's dealing with his divorce. So
right.
he's dealing with the divorce from Josephine, and he's trying to negotiate another imperial marriage to a princess of Europe somewhere who can bear some children,
Mm,
because he'd sired some illegitimate kids. So he knew he wasn't shooting blanks, and he wanted an heir, so to
right.
speak. And he wanted an heir, and so at first he thought maybe Alexander's sister.
Right.
That was the first choice, and then when that didn't pan out, he obviously married Marie Louise of Austria. But I think those negotiations in 1810 took so much of his time, and he prioritized those, and then turned over command of the army of Portugal to what I believe to be his most trusted marshal, and the one that he thought of all of them most capable of pulling this thing off.
Yeah.
After all, Massena in 1809 had performed miracles at Wagram, fully engaged. And then when it looks like the Austrians are going to outflank the left corps, or the left flank of the French army, Napoleon orders Massena to break contact and move his corps down to forestall that Austrian advance.
Yeah.
That's really, really tricky to do. And
Yeah.
Massena still had it. He'd been wounded. He was in a carriage and still doing all this. So I think in Napoleon's mind, Massena still had it going on. But Massena was not the same general of 1796, 1797 into 99. And
Okay.
it just didn't go well. And Clauzel was part of that. He was part of Junot's Eighth Corps.
Yeah.
And well, the news gets worse.
Yeah, we're coming up to that. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Um,
I'll let you
in
lead us there.
Yeah, in 1810, he's made Baron of the Empire by Napoleon, which is great. But his greatest moment, or I guess moment of infamy, comes 2 years later at the pivotal Battle of Salamanca.
Yeah.
He's working under Marshal Marmont. Can you provide the story of Clauzel's actions that may have saved the French army in that battle?
Yeah, so this is a really unfortunate. You want to talk about a battlefield promotion? As soon as the battle and the masterstroke by Wellington, he sees the French who are marching and they're strung out. They're not really in a position where the divisions of Marshal Marmont's army can support one another effectively, and so Wellington falls upon the French army, and then almost immediately Marmont is wounded and taken out of action. And
Mm-hmm.
then very, very shortly after that, General Bonnet, his second in command, was also wounded and knocked out of service.
Mm-hmm.
So Clauzel, then, as the senior officer, then has to take command of this army, which is in the process of getting absolutely eviscerated
Mm-hmm.
by Wellington. And Clauzel directed several counterattacks to try and forestall disaster, but disaster nevertheless was there, and a combination of Clauzel at least keeping his head, providing some sort of stuff, and General Foy, who I know you've covered,
Yeah.
covered the army well for that. His division covered the French retreat.
Yeah, I was reading that for 30 minutes though, when the first two guys went down, nobody knew who was in command, because you don't plan on that in your head. Like, all right, what if the first two generals get killed or knocked out? Who's third in command? I mean, maybe you do, but you don't plan on it every day.
Well, and the French, God bless them here, were really caught flat-footed. And after several weeks to close to a month, Marmont had done pretty well here and outmaneuvered Wellington on some occasions. And I think confidence in the French ranks was running pretty high. So
Mhm.
that the fact that they had gotten surprised at all was a difficult thing to deal with. And then in quick succession to have your two commanders go down, and Wellington has undeservedly a reputation for being a defensive general. So I don't think the French expected an attack. They certainly didn't there. They were caught flat. I mean, everything that could have gone wrong at that moment in time did go wrong.
Right, right.
But at least, Clauzel did keep his head, and it did organize some sort of resistance, futile though it was. And between he and Foy, they covered the retreat. And,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah, it could have been a lot worse, though, I think, if he hadn't stepped in.
yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, he's eventually wounded, and he's sent back to France to recover from his wounds, but is back at the Spanish front under Marshal Soult by January 1813, fighting at Orthez and Toulouse.
Right.
Napoleon abdicates in 1814, April 1814, and Clauzel serves under the returning Bourbon royals. But
Mhm.
what happens when Napoleon returns in 1815? Does Clauzel flock back to Napoleon?
Yeah, actually he does, and he was a pretty enthusiastic,
Bonapartist.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And he ends up going right back to where he knows so well, down in the Western Pyrenees.
Mm.
Um, and then, after the second abdication, um, Clausel's in some trouble. As like so many of those generals were, when they rallied to the Bonapartist cause after during 1815. He's not in good graces with the restored Bourbons.
Mhm.
And Clauzel actually goes to the United States and
Ah.
ends up living near Mobile. And there was quite
Oh, yeah.
a
I haven't really
contingent.
talked on this on my podcast yet. The Olive and Vine Colony?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And there was a colony near, there was one in Alabama. It might have been called Elba, actually. In Alabama, there were quite a few lots of places where Bonapartists fled and resettled. So,
Mhm.
yep.
But he doesn't stay there very long. When does he return to France? I believe he gets pardoned by the Bourbons at some point.
Yeah, there was a general amnesty given, and he returns to France in 1820.
Okay.
And then resumes serving in the French army, which of course now is the Bourbon regime.
Right.
Yep.
And it seems like his career kind of reignites during the kind of their colonial expansion to Algeria, right?
Yeah, and before that he was elected to the Chamber of Deputies between 1827 and 1830. So he did embark on a political career in
Mhm.
addition to his military career. And then after the revolution in 1830, he resumes military command.
Yeah, and he becomes Marshal of France in 1831. That must have been a pretty good feeling for him.
Well, I think he probably thought it would have been just desserts after, all the time and energy he had spent serving France.
Right.
Um, and so he does, in fact, lead the invasion of Algeria, um, which was successful, at least initially.
Hmm.
There were a lot of politics involved in that uh, adventure in Algeria. And of course, ever since, really, Algeria has been a difficult conversation for France.
Sure.
In fact, I was in France when I was doing dissertation research back in the 90s. A lot of those Algerian documents were just being released.
Mm.
And there was a lot of heartache and heartburn and things relating to all things Algeria. That's been
Yeah.
it continues to be an issue
Yeah.
for the French.
Yeah. For sure. But regarding Clauzel, after several victories in Algeria, he suffers a major loss at Constantine in 1836 and is recalled.
Yeah.
He lives in retirement till his death in April of 1842. What do you think his legacy is? Because it seems like he had a good career after Napoleon, and he had a good career during Napoleon. Yeah, just kind of a long storied military career, don't you think?
Yeah, I think he is regarded as a solid officer, dependable. What the French would call it, he has a lot of sang-froid. He's cool under pressure, and he certainly fought in the theaters where there wasn't a lot of glory.
Right.
Which is an enormous currency for the French military, and I think he toiled, and I think that's a fair word, with some hard assignments and some hard posts, and some hard living. And anytime you have to go against Wellington, you're not beating up the bumblers of you're not facing the unfortunate General Mack in the peninsula.
Yeah.
And you're not involved in serious colonial entanglements with Algeria. So I know that he must have thought that defeat in Constantine in 1836 would have really damaged his career. But I think in general, especially a century and more removed from that, I think folks regard him as a solid, capable officer.
Yeah, indeed. And I think those troops back in Salamanca probably owe him a debt of gratitude, because it could have gone a lot worse.
It's hard to imagine how it could have, but yes, you're right.
Well,
it could
I don't want to convey that the British didn't suffer casualties too. There were some, a good size loss on the British side as well.
Yeah, it was a hard. Well, I hesitate to even say it was a hard-won victory. It was a complete victory, but at least Clauzel maintained the presence of a French army from which they could build out from there. And there were still 2 more years of fighting to go before the war ended, and the British pushed themselves into southern France. So,
yeah, indeed. Well, thank you for that education on Marshal Clauzel. It was very interesting, my friend. Good stuff. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and again, if you want to find Charles on Twitter, it's Bubbles the Vampire. And yeah, great talking to you again.
Appreciate it, John. Thanks.
Thank you.